Charlotte Whitmore threw her engagement ring across the marble floor of Edward Caldwell's study the night she discovered he had forged her father's signature on 18 separate documents. She did not cry. She did not beg. She picked up the stack of papers she had spent 3 weeks secretly gathering, pressed them against her chest, and looked the most powerful man in Colorado straight in the eye. "You made a mistake," she said quietly. "You forgot that I know how to read." He laughed. He would not be laughing for long. If this story already has you feeling something, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now and follow along until the very end. Because what happens next will stay with you. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Charlotte Whitmore had spent 26 years being exactly what everyone told her to be. She wore the right dresses. She attended the right dinners. She smiled at the right people and laughed at the right moments, and never once said anything that might disturb the carefully arranged peace of her social world. Her mother had taught her that a woman of her standing did not raise her voice. Her father had taught her that reputation was everything. And the man she was engaged to marry, Edward Caldwell, third-generation Colorado money, owner of half the valley's land and most of its goodwill, had spent 3 years teaching her that her opinions were charming when they agreed with his and exhausting when they didn't. Charlotte had believed, for most of her life, that this was simply how the world worked. She stopped believing that on the 14th of June, 1882, at approximately 9:30 in the evening, when she opened a locked drawer in Edward's private study while looking for a spare pen and found 18 documents with her father's signature on them. Documents her father had never seen, never signed, and never would have agreed to in 1,000 years. She knew her father's handwriting. She had watched him write letters every Sunday morning since she was 4 years old, sitting beside him at his desk while he dipped his pen and made careful, deliberate loops. The signature on these papers was close. It was very close. But the loop on the capital W was wrong. Her father pressed harder at the beginning of letters, not at the end. These signatures pressed harder at the end. Charlotte stood in the dim light of Edward's study, with 18 documents in her hands, and the slow, cold understanding that the man she was supposed to marry in 6 weeks had been systematically transferring her family's assets into his own accounts for the better part of 2 years. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did what her father had always told her to do when she encountered a problem she did not yet understand. She started reading. By the time Edward found her standing at his desk an hour later, she had read every page twice and memorized the account numbers, the dates, the names of the 2 witnesses who had apparently been present for signings that never happened. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face was perfectly calm. And the look in her eyes when she turned around to face him was something Edward Caldwell had never seen on her before. He stopped in the doorway. "Charlotte," he said, "what are you doing in here?" "Reading," she said. "Those are private business documents." "Yes," she agreed. "They are." He crossed the room slowly, the way a man moves when he is trying to decide which version of a conversation he is about to have. He was handsome in the way that wealthy men in Colorado often were, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He had always reminded her slightly of a portrait, pleasant to look at, no depth behind the eyes. "I can explain those," he said. "Can you?" Charlotte set the documents carefully on the desk, smoothing the edges with her fingertips. "Then explain the signatures." He paused. "Your father agreed to a series of investment restructurings." "My father's handwriting slopes left," Charlotte said. "His capital letters press down at the start. Every letter he has written me in the past 22 years is consistent. These signatures press down at the finish. Whoever signed these documents was imitating my father's hand. They were imitating it well, but they were not him." Something shifted in Edward's expression. It was subtle. It was fast. If she had not been watching for it, she would have missed it. "You're upset," he said. "You've been under a great deal of stress with the wedding preparations. I think you're misreading something that's quite straightforward." "I'm not misreading anything." "Charlotte, you forged my father's signature," she said, "on 18 documents. You used those documents to transfer property and investment holdings out of Whitmore accounts and into accounts registered under your name and under the names of two men I've never heard of. And you have been doing this for at least 22 months. The room was quiet. Edward Caldwell looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen from him before. It was not guilt. It was not even anger. It was something colder and more calculating than either of those things. "Put the documents down," he said. "No." "Charlotte, put them down. You forged my father's name," she said again, and her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and something inside her chest that had been carefully arranged and managed and kept quiet for 26 years had broken open like a dam, and she found that she was not afraid of him at all. "You stole from my family, and I am going to—" "You are going to do nothing," Edward said, and his voice had changed. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was harder. "Do you understand what you're holding in your hands? You are holding private business documents in a private study that you entered without permission. If you walk out of this room with those papers, you will be accused of theft. If you speak about what you think you've seen to anyone in this town, I will tell them you have had a breakdown. I will tell them the stress of the wedding has been too much for you. I will tell them you came into my study in a hysterical state and began making accusations about documents you don't have the business education to understand." Charlotte looked at him. "And they will believe me," he continued quietly, almost gently, as if he were explaining something to a child. "Because I am Edward Caldwell, and you are a woman who has been crying at dress fittings for the past 3 weeks, which 3 separate people can confirm, because I made sure of it." The silence in the room was absolute. Charlotte set the documents back on the desk. She smoothed the stack one more time. She picked up the engagement ring from her right hand. She had moved it there weeks ago because the setting had been bothering the skin on her left, and she set it on top of the stack of papers. "You're right," she said. "You are Edward Caldwell." She turned and walked toward the door. "And I," she said without looking back, "am the woman who memorized every account number on every one of those documents." She walked out of the study, down the hallway, through the grand entrance of the Caldwell estate, and out into the Colorado night. She had no plan. She had no money she could access before Edward had time to move it. She had nothing but 18 account numbers, 2 witness names, and the absolute certainty that she was not going to spend the rest of her life pretending she hadn't seen what she saw. What happened next happened faster than Charlotte had imagined possible. Within 48 hours, Edward had spoken to 6 of the most influential people in their social circle. He had been strategic about it, not accusatory, not dramatic, just quietly, sympathetically concerned. Charlotte had not been herself. The wedding pressure had overwhelmed her. She had become fixated on things she didn't understand. He was heartbroken, of course, but a man had to consider whether a woman in such a state was truly ready for marriage. The engagement was quietly dissolved. Charlotte's father, confronted with documents he didn't recognize, and a son-in-law who expressed nothing but regret and concern, chose the explanation that caused the least disruption to his world. His daughter had misunderstood. Business was complicated. Women often found it confusing. Her mother did not visit her. Her friends, the women she had grown up beside, attended school with, shared confidences with over a dozen years of teas and parties and long summer afternoons, sent polite notes expressing sympathy for her difficult time, and declined invitations she had not extended. Within a week, Charlotte Whitmore had gone from being one of the most admired young women in the Colorado Valley to being the subject of careful, pitying whispers in every parlor she had ever sat in. She tried twice to speak to people she trusted. A family attorney who had known her father for 20 years listened to her for 40 minutes, nodded at appropriate intervals, and told her that without documentary evidence, there was nothing he could do, and that perhaps she might benefit from some time in the country. A woman she had considered a genuine friend, Margaret Aldis, whose children Charlotte had helped teach to read, listened for 10 minutes before taking her hand and saying, very gently, that Edward was a good man, and Charlotte should consider whether her feelings about the broken engagement might be coloring her perceptions. Charlotte thanked her. She walked out of Margaret's house. She did not knock on another door. Because here was the thing about being a woman in 1882 Colorado who had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. The world did not particularly care what she had seen. The world cared about who was telling the story. And the story that Edward Caldwell told, of a fragile, overwhelmed, slightly unhinged young woman who had invented a crisis out of grief and confusion, was a story the world was entirely prepared to believe. It required nothing of anyone. It asked no one to examine their own choices or question a man they trusted. It was the comfortable story, the one that left everything exactly as it was. Charlotte's story required people to be uncomfortable. It never stood a chance. She spent 3 weeks in her childhood bedroom with the curtains drawn, and she went through something during those 3 weeks that she would later describe to the only person who ever asked her about it, as the experience of watching her entire sense of reality quietly dismantled. She had believed in goodness. She had believed that truth, when presented clearly and calmly, would be recognized as truth. She had believed that people who loved you would choose to hear you, even when what you said was hard. She had been wrong on all 3 counts. On the 22nd day, Charlotte's father came to her room and sat in the chair beside her window and told her, with genuine kindness and genuine regret, that he had arranged for her to go stay with a distant cousin in Denver, where she might recover her equilibrium and perhaps, in time, find a more suitable match. The Caldwell situation was unfortunate, but her name was not entirely ruined. There were still options. Charlotte looked at her father, the man she had adored, the man whose handwriting she knew better than her own. She asked him one question. "Did you read them? The documents he showed you?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "He showed me the agreements," he said carefully. "They were complex, but—" "Did you read them?" she said. "All the way through?" Her father looked at his hands. "There were a great many of them," he said. And Edward explained. "No," Charlotte said, very quietly. He didn't explain. He reassured. "Those are different things." Her father had no answer for that. 3 days later, Charlotte packed a single bag. She did not tell her parents where she was going, partly because she wasn't certain herself, and partly because she had come to understand that the telling would only result in another conversation, in which she was gently managed and carefully redirected, and ultimately returned to the comfortable position of agreeing that everything was fine, and everyone meant well, and she simply needed to rest. She did not need to rest. She needed to go somewhere that the name Caldwell meant nothing, and the name Whitmore meant nothing, and the only thing that mattered was what a person actually was. She had heard, in the way that people hear things they weren't meant to hear, standing outside parlor doors at gatherings she was no longer officially invited to, that there was land to the west. Mountains. Country so remote that people went there to disappear, or to start again, or occasionally both. Country where a person could exist outside the reach of Colorado society, if they were determined enough and didn't much care for comfort. She was not sure she was determined enough. She was absolutely sure she didn't care for comfort anymore. Charlotte Whitmore left her family's house on a Tuesday morning before anyone else had woken, carrying one bag, $40 she had saved over 2 years from birthday gifts and household allowances, and the complete certainty that whatever came next could not possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. She was not entirely right about that. The mountains were harder than she had anticipated. She had hired a horse in the first town she reached, a decision that had seemed practical and had proven expensive, and she had followed directions given her by a weathered man at the livery stable who had looked at her city boots and her single bag and the careful, controlled way she held herself and had said, "Ma'am, you sure you want to go up that way?" "Yes," Charlotte had said. He'd looked at her a moment longer. "There's a man up in those hills, Blackwood. People say he ain't friendly." "I'm not looking for friendly," Charlotte had said. "I'm looking for somewhere to go." The man had nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided they've said their piece, and the rest is someone else's business. She had ridden for 2 days. On the afternoon of the second day, the sky that had been gray and heavy since morning finally made good on its threat, and the rain that came down was not the gentle, civilized kind of rain she was accustomed to, the kind that pattered pleasantly against parlor windows while one sat warm inside. It was mountain rain, cold and sideways and relentless. And the trail she was following turned to mud beneath the horse's hooves. And the horse, who had been game enough on the flat, began to move with a reluctance that frightened her. She had another mile to go, she thought, before she reached the place the liveryman had described. A fork in the trail, a line of pines, a cabin set back from the ridge. She did not make it a mile. The horse went down on a stretch of mud-slicked rock so quickly that Charlotte barely had time to pull her feet from the stirrups before she was thrown sideways onto the trail. She landed on her hands and one knee, and the pain was sharp and immediate. And when she looked up, the horse was on its feet again, but trembling, one foreleg held slightly off the ground, and the rain was coming down so hard she could barely see the tree line. Charlotte sat on the muddy trail for a moment. She had lost everything she had ever believed in. She had been humiliated by people she loved. She had ridden for 2 days into the mountains on the word of a man at a livery stable. She was sitting in the mud in the rain with a lame horse and no shelter and no plan. She started very quietly to laugh. It was not a happy sound, but it was real in a way that almost nothing else had been for the past month, and she sat in the mud and laughed until the laughter ran itself out, and then she got to her feet, took the horse's reins, and started walking. She had not gone 50 yards when she heard hoofbeats on the trail behind her. She turned. The man on the horse was large. Even in the rain and the dim light of the approaching evening, she could see that he was large, not in the soft way of wealthy men who ate well and sat often, but in the way of someone who had spent years doing physical work in difficult country. He was wearing a dark oilskin coat and a hat that had been battered by more than one storm, and he sat his horse the way men sit horses when riding is simply how they move through the world rather than something they do on occasion. He stopped about 10 feet from her. He looked at her. He looked at the horse. He looked at the trail behind her and the trail ahead of her and the angle of the rain and the light in the sky. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your horse is lame." "Yes," Charlotte said. "You're about a quarter mile from the cabin." "I thought I had farther. Trail bends, makes it feel longer." He looked at her again. His eyes were dark, and his face was weathered, and there was something in his expression that she could not immediately name. Not unfriendly exactly, but careful. The way a person looks when they have learned to take their time before deciding what something is. "You're the woman from the valley." It was not a question. Charlotte straightened. Her knee hurt. Her hands were bleeding slightly where she'd caught herself on the rock. Her dress was soaked through and her hat was somewhere behind her on the trail, and she was standing in the rain on a mountain with a man who everyone she'd ever met had told her to fear. "Yes," she said. "I am." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, "Leave the horse. I'll come back for her. Get up behind me." "I don't need—" "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "It's going to be dark in 40 minutes, and the temperature's dropping. You can argue with me about it tomorrow if you want. Tonight, get on the horse." Charlotte Whitmore, who had spent 26 years being told what to do by people who did not have her best interests at heart, looked up at Nathaniel Blackwood, whom everyone in the valley below called dangerous and violent and unfit for civilized company, and saw a man who was waiting for her to make her own decision. She took his offered hand and got on the horse. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the ride to the cabin, but when they arrived and he helped her down and opened the door, and she stepped into the warmth of the fire he'd left burning. She stood for a moment in the doorway and felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten it existed. Safe. Not comfortable. Not reassured. Not managed. Safe. Nathaniel Blackwood moved past her to put more wood on the fire, and he did not look at her expectantly, or hover near her, or wait for her to perform gratitude. And she stood in the warmth of his cabin and understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a great deal of loss, that she had made a very long journey to get here, and she was not ready to leave yet. She did not know what came next, but she knew, for the first time in a very long time, that the person standing in this room was still herself, and that, she decided, was where she would start. She slept for 14 hours. Charlotte had not slept more than 3 or 4 hours at a stretch since the night she found the documents in Edward's study, and her body, apparently, had decided that it was done being polite about it. She woke up on a narrow cot near the fire with a rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin, her boots removed and set neatly beside the door, and absolutely no memory of lying down. For one disoriented moment, she did not know where she was. Then she heard the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, steady and rhythmic and unhurried, and everything came back. She sat up carefully. Her knee ached where she'd landed on the trail. Her palms were scraped raw. The fire was still going, which meant someone had kept it through the night, and the cabin was warm in the way that only a well-tended fire makes a space warm. Not stuffy, not smothering, but genuinely, practically warm. The kind of warmth that has a purpose rather than a performance. She looked around the cabin for the first time with eyes that were actually functioning. It was small. One main room. A table. 2 chairs. A shelf of supplies organized with a precision that surprised her. Tins labeled in a careful hand. Tools hung in order of size. A stack of journals on the far end with their spines facing out. A door at the back, she assumed, led to a second room. No decoration. Nothing on the walls except a single map, hand-drawn, with markings she couldn't read from where she sat. It was the room of a man who had decided that everything in his life was going to serve a function, or it wasn't going to be there. The axe sounds stopped. A moment later, the door opened, and Nathaniel Blackwood came inside, knocking mud from his boots before he crossed the threshold. He looked at her sitting upright on the cot and gave a short nod that managed to communicate both that he had noticed she was awake and that he was not going to make an occasion of it. "There's coffee," he said. "Thank you." He poured a tin cup from the pot on the stove and set it on the table without bringing it to her, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. She got up, limped slightly on her sore knee, and came to the table herself. She sat down across from him. I was already looking at something else. A small leather journal he'd opened on his side of the table, a pencil in his hand. He was not ignoring her. He was simply not performing attention at her. There was a difference, and she was aware of it in a way that made something in her chest feel strange. She drank her coffee. It was strong enough to be nearly offensive, and it was the best thing she had tasted in a month. "My horse," she said. "Brought her in last night. Left foreleg. She'll be sound in a week if she rests. I'll need pay you for the trouble." He glanced up from the journal. "No, you won't." "Mr. Blackwood." "Nate," he said, and went back to his journal. "Mr. Blackwood was my father, and he wasn't a man worth naming yourself after." Charlotte wrapped both hands around her tin cup and studied him for a moment. He was younger than she had expected from the descriptions she'd heard. Early 30s, she thought, with the kind of face that looked like it had seen weather and meant it. There was a scar along his jaw that disappeared under a short beard, and his hands on the journal were scarred too. The knuckles of his right hand slightly thickened in the way of a man who has broken them and let them heal without much fuss. The people in the valley had said he was dangerous. Looking at him across the table in the morning light, with his pencil moving in his journal and his coffee going cold at his elbow, Charlotte thought he looked like a man who had simply stopped caring what people thought of him, which in her recent experience was a quality she was beginning to find more admirable than she'd expected. "The people in town," she said carefully. "They warned me about you." "I know. They said you were violent." He stopped writing. He didn't look up immediately, and when he did, his expression had not changed exactly, but something behind his eyes had gone quieter. "Do you believe everything people in town say?" "I used to," Charlotte said. "I'm revising that position." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to his journal. They sat in silence for a few minutes, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which struck Charlotte as remarkable, given that she was sitting in a mountain cabin with a stranger that half the valley considered unfit for human company. She had made a decision somewhere between waking and coffee. She was not going to explain herself to this man. She was not going to offer him the story of what had happened to her in the valley below as a form of justification for her presence here, the way she had been doing for the past month, presenting her case to people who had already decided the verdict. If he wanted to know why she was here, He could ask. If he didn't ask, she wasn't going to volunteer it. He didn't ask. He finished whatever he was writing, closed the journal, finished his coffee cold without appearing to notice, and stood up. "I've got work to do," he said. "You're welcome to stay until your horse is sound. The supplies are there." He nodded toward the shelf. "Help yourself. I'll be back before dark." He picked up his coat and his hat. He was at the door before Charlotte said, "Why?" He turned. "Why are you letting me stay? You don't know me. You don't know what happened or who I am or whether I'm going to." She stopped. "People in town would tell you I'm untrustworthy." Nate Blackwood looked at her steadily. "People in town tell me I'm dangerous," he said. "I've found it's useful to form my own opinions." He walked out. Charlotte sat at the table for a long time after the door closed. Then she got up, found a cloth and a basin of water, cleaned the scrapes on her hands, drank a second cup of coffee, and began looking around the cabin for something useful she could do. She was not going to sit still. Sitting still was what she'd done for the past month, and it had nearly finished her. She found the supply shelf first, and the organization that had initially impressed her revealed itself, upon closer inspection, to be the organization of a man who knew where everything was, but had never had a reason to develop a system that would make sense to anyone else. The tins were labeled, but not grouped. Salt was between lamp oil and a tin of nails. Coffee was between what appeared to be a medical kit and a box of ammunition. The logic, if there was one, escaped her entirely. She found a ledger on the second shelf, below the journals. She almost put it back. Then she opened it. The entries were in the same careful hand as the journal. Clear, precise, honest. But the numbers were wrong. Not wrong as in fraudulent, but wrong as in the accounts of a man who was good at keeping records and had never had anyone show him a better method. He was tracking expenses against income, in a way that worked, but was creating blind spots she could see immediately. Places where costs were being absorbed without being counted. Places where he was underpricing his labor by a significant margin. Charlotte had grown up watching her father manage investments, before Edward had helped him stop. She sat down at the table with the ledger and began to work. She was still working when Nate came back before dark, as promised. He stopped inside the door and looked at her and then at the table, where the ledger was open and she had filled 3 pages of a separate notebook she'd found with reworked figures and notes in her own handwriting. "What are you doing?" he said. "Your accounts are wrong," Charlotte said, without looking up. "Not dishonest, just inefficient. You're losing approximately $40 per quarter on timber supply costs that you're not tracking against market rates. And you've been undercharging the Delacroix Ranch for lumber by about 15% based on these figures here." She finally looked up. "I can fix it if you want. Or I can put it back exactly where I found it, and we'll say nothing more about it." Nate stood in the doorway of his own cabin and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You know accounts?" he said. "My father managed investments for 20 years, Charlotte said. "I sat with him most Sunday mornings while he worked. He didn't intend to teach me, but he didn't tell me to leave either, so I paid attention." Another pause. "Have you eaten?" he said. "No. I'll make something." He came the rest of the way into the cabin and hung his coat and hat. "You can tell me what you found." It was not an enthusiastic invitation, but it was an invitation, and Charlotte had learned the difference between a real one and a performed one, and this was real. She told him what she'd found. He asked 3 questions. Good questions. Specific, practical. The questions of a man who was not going to nod along to something he didn't understand just to be agreeable. She answered them, and when he pushed back on one of her calculations, she explained her reasoning, and he sat with it for a moment, and then he said, "That's right," in the same tone he might have used to acknowledge that it was going to rain, meaning it was simply accurate, and he was acknowledging accuracy, and that was the whole of it. Charlotte found it almost unbearably refreshing. They ate together at the table, salt pork and beans and bread that he had made himself, rough but solid and real. And they talked about the accounts, and then the conversation shifted sideways, the way conversations sometimes do when 2 people are both used to not saying very much, and she found herself asking him about the map on the wall. He told her about the survey work he'd done for 2 seasons in the Northern Territories, mapping land for a railroad company that had eventually used his surveys without paying him for them. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without self-pity, as a fact of record. But Charlotte heard the thing underneath it, because she had recently become very practiced at hearing the thing people didn't say. "They used your work and didn't compensate you," she said. "Correct. And when you objected?" A small pause. "They told people I'd submitted faulty surveys, that anything I'd done for them was my interpretation rather than accurate measurement." He looked at the map. "My interpretation. I spent 2 winters in that territory. I mapped 1,100 square miles." Charlotte put her fork down. "They took your work," she said slowly, "and then they made you the problem." He looked back at her. Something in his eyes had shifted, the careful distance dropping just slightly. "Yes," he said. "That is what they did. And no one who might have helped was interested in going up against a railroad company," he said. "Easier to believe I'd made errors." Charlotte sat with that for a moment. "I found documents in my fiancé's study," she said. She had not planned to say it. She said it anyway. Nate put down his own fork and gave her his attention, the full, still kind of attention she was learning was simply how he listened. She told him. Not all of it, not yet, but the shape of it, the signatures, the account numbers, the careful, systematic way in which Edward Caldwell had built a story around her before she even had time to understand she was inside it. The attorney who hadn't helped, the friends who had chosen not to believe her, her father who had looked at his own hands. She told it plainly, the way Nate told his own story, without performing her pain, without asking him to feel sorry for her. When she was done, the cabin was quiet. "He was thorough," Nate said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "He was." "But you memorized the account numbers." "Yes." "Before you left the room." "I had an hour with the documents before he found me." Nate looked at her steadily. "He underestimated you," he said. "Considerably." "That's his first mistake." Charlotte looked at him across the table. "What was his second?" "Letting you leave," Nate said. The fire crackled between them. Charlotte felt something shift in her chest. Not the fragile, desperate hope she'd been carrying since June, the kind that kept shattering every time she trusted it, but something quieter and more solid. Something that felt like being recognized. "I need somewhere to be," she said. "While I figure out what to do next. I won't be in your way. I can work. I can cook. I can manage accounts. I can do things that are useful." "I know you can," Nate said. "I already saw that." "Then? You can stay," he said. "As long as you need." He stood and began clearing the table, and the matter appeared for him to be settled. Charlotte helped clear the table. They worked in the same silence they'd found that morning, easy and uncrowded. 2 people who had both learned to be self-contained and were finding, with some surprise, that being in the same room did not require either of them to perform. She slept again that night, and better. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised her with how quickly it felt natural. Nate was out of the cabin before dawn most mornings, and Charlotte, who had never in her life woken before 7, found herself rising with the light. She started coffee. She worked on the accounts. She organized the supply shelf in a way that made sense. Not her way, but a way that accounted for how he actually moved through the space, which she had observed carefully enough by the 3rd day to understand. When he came back in the late afternoon, she had a record of what she'd found or fixed or sorted, and she presented it without ceremony, and he listened without pretense. And then he either agreed or he told her why she was wrong. And once she was wrong and she said so, and he nodded once and moved on without extracting any satisfaction from it. This was, she was finding, the most unusual quality she had ever encountered in a man. On the 4th day, Nathaniel came in from the fields with a letter. He dropped it on the table. Charlotte looked at it. It was addressed in a hand she didn't recognize, but the return address was Denver, a law firm she had heard of, one that had done work for railroad interests and land development. "What is this?" she said. "It comes once a month," Nate said. He poured coffee and did not sit. They want the land. Who does? Goes through different names, he said. A development company. An investment concern. Different letter, same offer. He looked at the letter without expression. Lower every time. Charlotte picked up the letter. She read it carefully. The language was polite and entirely without warmth. The kind of writing that had been engineered specifically to sound reasonable, while meaning something that was not. They're dropping the offer by 30% from what you described last month, she said. I know. That means they're not worried about finding another buyer. She looked up. That means they think they don't need to negotiate. Nate's jaw tightened, the first real tension she had seen in his face. They've been talking to people. Some of the families lower down sold last fall. The pressure's been building. Pressure how? How was quiet for a beat? Supply issues, tools that get lost, contracts that don't come through. He set down his cup. Nothing you could prove. Charlotte set the letter down very carefully. She knew this method. She had watched it from the other side. They're squeezing you, she said. The same way Edward squeezed my father. Not directly. Nothing traceable. Just consistent inconvenience until holding on becomes more painful than selling. Nate looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. Exactly that. Something connected in Charlotte's mind. A click, clean and decisive, like a key turning. Do you have the previous letters? She said. Every one. How far back? 14 months. Charlotte stood up. Then we have a record, she said. 14 months of correspondence showing a pattern of declining offers correlated with, do you have dates on the supply issues? The missing contracts? He stared at her. I keep records. Of course you do. She was already moving toward the shelf where she'd reorganized the journals. 14 months. That's enough to show a pattern to someone who knows what they're looking at. Charlotte. She stopped. He almost never used her name. She turned. Who's going to look at it? He said. His voice was quiet, but she heard the layer beneath the quiet. The exhausted layer. The one that had been fighting this for over a year and had nearly stopped believing the fight meant anything. I've written to 2 county officials. I've spoken to a lawyer in town who took my money and sent one letter that went nowhere. There is no one to show this to. Charlotte held his gaze. She thought about the attorney who had listened to her for 40 minutes and told her she needed rest. She thought about Margaret Aldous taking her hand and asking if her feelings might be coloring her perception. She thought about her father looking at his own hands. She thought about Edward Caldwell saying, with complete confidence, that no one would believe her. There will be, she said. She meant it the way a person means something when they have stopped hoping and arrived, on the other side of that particular loss, at something harder and more reliable. Not hope. Certainty. The kind that doesn't ask permission. Nate looked at her for a long moment. You sound very sure, he said. I have 18 account numbers memorized, Charlotte said. I have been sure about exactly one thing since June. Don't underestimate what that kind of sure can do. He held her gaze. Something passed across his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not quite trust, not all the way, not yet, but the beginning of it. The shape that trust makes when a person has been without it long enough that they've forgotten they're still capable of it. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. She sat back down at the table with the 14 months of letters and his records of the supply disruptions and the failed contracts, and she began building a case. She had done something like this before, she realized. In the months before June, she had been watching Edward's household accounts the way a person watches something they don't yet have words for, tracking small inconsistencies without knowing she was tracking them. Building a picture she hadn't understood she was building until the night she opened the drawer and found the documents and understood all at once what the picture had been showing her. She had done this before. She was better at it now. By the time Nate sat down across from her that evening to look at what she'd laid out, she had organized 14 months of pressure into something that had the shape of evidence. Dates, amounts, correlations. The pattern was clear to her. She traced it for him carefully, point by point. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, No one has ever done this. Done what? Put it together like this. He looked at the table, at everything she'd laid out. I knew it was happening. I couldn't. He stopped. I'm better with land than with paper. I'm better with paper than with land, Charlotte said. So far it seems like we're managing. He looked up at her. That almost smile again. The one she was learning was rarer and more valuable than any social performance she had ever sat through. We are, he said. 2 weeks into her time on the mountain, Charlotte did something she had not done since leaving her family's house. She wrote a letter, not to her parents, not to anyone who might have been expected to receive correspondence from her. She wrote to a woman named Helen Marsh, who was the aunt of a girl Charlotte had tutored 3 years ago, and who was, according to everything Charlotte had ever heard about her, relentlessly stubborn, deeply principled, and in possession of a husband who was a circuit judge. Charlotte had met Helen Marsh exactly twice, but she had paid attention both times. She wrote 3 drafts before she sent it. She chose every word with care because she had learned that a woman making an accusation had to be precise, where a man making the same accusation could afford to be general. She presented facts. She attached copies of the most relevant documents from Nate's collection. She asked for nothing except that the letter be read. She did not tell Nate she'd sent it. She was not superstitious exactly, but she had learned that some things, said aloud before they had roots, withered before they could grow. She mailed it on a Wednesday, walking down the trail herself to leave it at the small post office in the nearest settlement, 3 miles from the cabin. She walked back in the early afternoon and found Nate repairing a section of fence at the edge of the property. "Letter?" he said, without looking up from the fence. She stopped. "How did you know? You walked 4 miles round trip for something." He straightened and looked at her. "You don't pace yourself on flat ground when you're just walking. You paced yourself today." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "You're very observant," she said. "I've had to be." He went back to the fence. "Who did you write to?" She told him about Helen Marsh, about the circuit judge husband, about what she'd included and what she'd asked for, and what she'd been careful not to ask for, and why. Nate listened, hands still on the fence, not looking at her. When she was done, he was quiet for a bit. "That might be something," he said. "It might be nothing," Charlotte said honestly. "Yeah." He set the last post. "But you did it anyway." "Yes." He picked up his tools and turned toward the cabin, and as he passed her he said, so quietly she almost missed it over the sound of the wind, "Thank you." Charlotte stood for a moment, looking at the fence line, and the mountains beyond it, and the sky going pale at the edges. She had thanked people her whole life for things she should have been thanked for. This was the first time she had been thanked by someone who meant it exactly as much as they said it. She went back inside and set the kettle on. The weeks continued. The rhythm continued. And something else continued, quietly, underneath the rhythm, the way water moves under ice, present and patient, and going somewhere neither of them was quite looking at directly. She learned things about him. She learned that he read, more than she would have expected, and more widely. He had a particular interest in legal history and land law, which made sense, and also in botany, which did not fit any version of him she had been warned about, and fit every version of him she had actually found. He could name most of the plants in a 3-mile radius of the cabin and tell her which were medicinal and which were edible and which would make a person regret their choices. And he had the manner of someone who found this information deeply practical and also, she suspected, quietly beautiful. She learned that he had helped, over the past several years, at least 4 families in the surrounding area with food, supplies, and labor, completely without acknowledgement or recognition, because he did not do things for recognition. He did them because they needed doing. She learned that 2 of the families who had spread the worst stories about him in town were the same families he had helped most in the winter of 1880. When she pointed this out to him, he shrugged. "People tell stories that protect themselves," he said. "I was close enough to trouble at the time that naming me as the trouble was easier than explaining what actually happened." "That doesn't bother you?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "It bothered me considerably," he said. "At first. Then I decided it only bothered me because I wanted them to see me correctly. Once I stopped wanting that, it stopped hurting. Charlotte thought about that for a long time. She thought about it while she was working, and while she was eating, and while she was lying on the cot at night, listening to the mountain wind. And she thought about the version of herself that had walked into every room for 26 years, performing the kind of woman she believed other people needed her to be. "I don't know how to stop wanting that," she said finally, 2 days later, picking up the conversation as if they'd never put it down, which was one of the things she had discovered she could do with him. Set something down and come back to it without explanation or apology. He looked up from the journal he'd been writing in. "You're already doing it," he said. "I don't feel like I am." "You haven't asked me once what I think of you," he said. "Not once in 3 weeks. You've asked me what I think of your accounting, of your reasoning, of the case you're building, but not of you." Charlotte went still. She thought about it. Checked it against her memory of the past 3 weeks. He was right. She hadn't. "I don't know when that changed," she said. "Probably," Nate said, going back to his journal. "Around the time you realized there was nothing left to lose." He said it gently, but accurately. There was a short silence, and then Charlotte started to laugh. The real kind. The kind she hadn't done much of in a very long time. And after a moment, Nate looked up from his journal with an expression that was startled, and then, slowly, warm, and she thought, "This is it. This is the most unexpected place I have ever been, and the most honest, and I am not leaving until I have to." She did not say that, but he looked at her across the table, and something in his face said that he already knew. The morning everything changed was a Thursday, 24 days after she had arrived on his mountain. She heard hoofbeats before Nate did. He was outside and she was inside, and she heard them first because she had been listening for them. The way you listen for things you've asked for and half expect and still aren't ready for when they come. She stepped to the door. 3 riders on the trail below. Not local men. Dressed too well and riding too deliberately, the posture of men who have been sent to deliver a message rather than ask a question. Behind her, she heard Nate come around the side of the cabin. He came to stand beside her and looked at the riders the way he looked at most things, steadily, without hurry, reading them before they arrived. "Do you know them?" Charlotte said quietly. "The one on the left," he said, "works for the land company." A pause. "The one in the middle," she said, equally quiet, and something cold had moved into her chest, because she had recognized him the moment he'd cleared the last bend in the trail. "I know." Nate looked at her. She did not look back at him. She was looking at Edward Caldwell, riding up the mountain toward them, with the comfortable expression of a man who had never yet arrived somewhere and been turned away. Edward Caldwell had always known how to make an entrance. He rode up the last stretch of trail with the easy confidence of a man who had never arrived anywhere and been made to feel unwelcome, which was true, because the places Edward went were places where he had arranged in advance to be received. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He came to a stop about 20 feet from where Charlotte and Nate stood in the cabin doorway, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the particular warmth of a man who is certain his warmth will be welcomed. "Charlotte," he said. His voice was the same, pleasant, careful, the voice of a man who had spent years calibrating exactly how much warmth to project. She had spent 3 weeks breathing mountain air and sitting across a table from a man who said exactly what he meant, and Edward Caldwell's voice now sounded to her like a musical instrument badly out of tune, close enough to the right notes to be almost convincing, wrong enough to be unbearable. "Edward," she said. She did not move from where she stood. He looked at Nate. A brief look, assessing, the kind that takes a full inventory of a person in 2 seconds and files everything away. Then he looked back at Charlotte, and his expression shifted into something she recognized. The gentle, concerned look he deployed when he wanted someone to feel managed without knowing they were being managed. "I've been worried about you," he said. "We all have." "Who is we?" Charlotte said. A small pause. "Your parents, your friends, people who care about you." He glanced at Nate again, briefly, meaningfully. "People who want to make sure you're safe." "I am safe," Charlotte said. "Charlotte." He swung down from his horse, unhurried, and the two men who had ridden up with him stayed mounted, which she noted. Staying mounted was a choice. It meant they expected to leave quickly, or it meant they wanted to appear larger than they were. Possibly both. I understand that you were upset. What happened between us? The way things ended. I know that was painful for you, and I should have handled it with more care. She looked at him. He was apologizing. Edward Caldwell was standing on Nathaniel Blackwood's mountain and offering her an apology, which meant he wanted something significant enough to cost him the currency of a grudging admission of fault, and the question was, what? Beside her, Nate had not moved or spoken. He was watching Edward with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, and she was aware of him the way she was aware of a solid wall at her back. Not because she needed it, but because it was there. "What do you want, Edward?" she said. The concern on his face deepened, became more elaborate. "I want to bring you home. I want—" "No," she said. He stopped. "No," she said again, more quietly, because she didn't need volume. "You're not here for me. You've never done anything in your life primarily for someone else. So tell me what you actually want." The man who had ridden up on Edward's left shifted in his saddle. Edward's jaw tightened, just slightly, just for a moment. The pleasant expression stayed in place, but it required slightly more effort now. "I want to talk to you," he said. "Privately." "No," Charlotte said. "Charlotte, whatever you have to say to me, you can say it here." She kept her voice level. "Or you can leave. Those are the options." A long pause. Edward looked at Nate. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, and now his voice had changed, dropped into a different register, the business register, man to man. "I appreciate the hospitality you've shown Miss Whitmore. She's been going through a difficult time, and I'm sure you've been—" "I don't recall asking your assessment of what I've been," Nate said. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd arrived. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without heat, as a statement of fact. But something in his tone made the man on the left shift in his saddle again, and Edward stopped speaking for a full second, which, Charlotte suspected, did not happen to him often. "Of course," Edward said, recovering smoothly. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Nate said. "You meant to tell me something about the woman standing beside me using the word hospitality, so that I'd understand my role in this situation and behave accordingly." He looked at Edward steadily. "I understand my role fine." Another silence. Charlotte watched Edward recalibrate. She had seen him do it before. The almost imperceptible adjustment behind the eyes. The selection of a new approach. The pivot so smooth it was nearly invisible. He was very good at it. "All right," Edward said. He looked at Charlotte directly, and this time the pleasant concern was gone, and what replaced it was something more honest and therefore more dangerous. "I'll be direct. I know you've been gathering documents. I know you've been attempting to contact people. I know about the letter you sent to Helen Marsh." The cold moved back into Charlotte's chest. She did not show it. "Then you know exactly what I've been doing," she said. "I know what you think you're doing," he said. "And I'm here to tell you, before this goes further than it needs to go, that you are making a mistake. The documents you believe you memorized, the accounts, the figures. Charlotte, you saw papers that were part of a complex, multi-party financial arrangement that you didn't have the context to understand. I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the people you're speaking to are going to hear the same thing from men who have 30 years of business experience between them, and your word against theirs." "Is not what I'm offering," Charlotte said. He stopped. "I'm not offering my word," she said. "I'm offering documentation. 14 months of correspondence showing a pattern of declining property offers, correlated with supply disruptions and contract failures, targeting this land specifically. I'm offering copies of your letters to Blackwood's property, sent through 3 different intermediary companies, all of which trace back to accounts associated with your business interests." She kept her voice completely even. "I have been an accountant's daughter for 26 years, Edward. I know what a paper trail looks like." The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever heard. Edward stared at her. For the first time in 3 years together, in 3 years of dinners and gatherings and private conversations, she saw on his face an expression she had never seen there before. Uncertainty. Real, unmanaged, genuine uncertainty. It lasted only a moment. Then it was gone, and something colder moved in behind it. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you're starting." "Yes," Charlotte said, "I do. There are men involved in this who have more influence in this territory than you can imagine. If you push this, then I push it," she said. "You will be destroyed," Edward said, and his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, the way a surgeon's voice drops when he is explaining to a patient that the procedure will be painful. "Not because I want that, but because that is what happens to people who challenge interests larger than themselves. You saw what happened when you tried to speak in Denver. You saw how quickly the story changed. Do you think it will be different here?" Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father looking at his hands. She thought about Margaret Aldous and her gentle, pitying eyes. She thought about sitting in the mud on a mountain trail, in the rain, laughing, because there was nothing left to protect. "Yes," she said. "I think it will be different here." "Why?" he said. She let the pause sit for just a moment. "Because this time," she said, "I'm not alone." She did not look at Nate when she said it. She didn't need to. She felt him beside her the way you feel solid ground beneath your feet. Not dramatically, not with gratitude, just with the simple functional knowledge that it was there and it would hold. Edward's eyes moved to Nate. Something calculated moved through them. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "I'm going to make you an offer. One time. A fair price for this land. Above market. Substantially above what my associates have previously communicated. You take the offer. You take the money. And everyone walks away from this cleanly." Nate looked at him. The silence stretched. "No," Nate said. "I want you to think carefully." "I thought carefully," Nate said. "No." "The alternative is that you leave my property," Nate said. "Now. While that's still the only thing I'm asking." The man on the left put his hand on his saddlebag. Not on a weapon, not quite, but near enough to one that the gesture meant something. Nate looked at the man with an expression that did not change at all. "I'd move that hand," he said, in the same quiet, even tone he used for everything. The man moved the hand. Edward looked between them. Something in his face had settled into a grimness that was, Charlotte thought, probably the most honest thing she had ever seen on him. The performance was gone now. This was the actual man. The one who had built a careful life on the labor and loss of other people, and had come, genuinely, to believe that was simply how things were done. "You're making a mistake," he said to her one final time. "I've heard that before," Charlotte said. "From you specifically." He mounted his horse. He looked at her from the saddle with an expression that had something in it she hadn't expected. Not quite anger, not quite contempt, but something almost like regret, which was strange, which she turned over in her mind long after he had ridden back down the trail. She thought that maybe the regret was real. She thought that some men could genuinely regret the damage they caused and still cause it, could genuinely wish things were otherwise, and still choose the version of things that served them. She thought that was probably the most frightening kind of man there was. They watched the three riders go until the trail bent and they disappeared. Neither Charlotte nor Nate said anything for a moment. Then Nate said, "He knows about the letter to Helen Marsh." "Yes, that means he has someone watching the post office, or someone in her household." Charlotte had already been thinking that. Then Helen Marsh needs to be warned, before he can move to contain whatever she might have already set in motion. He turned toward the cabin. "You need to write another letter, tonight." "I know." She followed him inside, already thinking. "But that's not the only problem." He looked at her. "He said men with influence in this territory," she said. "That wasn't a bluff. Edward doesn't bluff. He informs. If he came up here himself, it means he's already tried the slower methods and they haven't worked, which means he's moving to something faster, something more direct." Nate sat down at the table. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was running through the same sequence she was. "How long?" he said. "Before he acts directly?" She thought about it. "He'll want to avoid anything that leaves him exposed. He'll want it to look like something else." She sat across from him. "A week, maybe less." Nate looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. The question was so simple and so completely unlike every other question she had been asked in the past 4 months, all of which had been variations of "What are you going to do?" and "Do you understand what you're risking?" and "Have you considered the consequences?" that it stopped her for a second. "More copies," she said. "Of everything, sent to more than one place. I can ride to 3 different towns. I need you to do it tomorrow. Then I'll do it tomorrow." He pulled the ledger toward him. "Write me a list. Everything you want copied. Every person you want copies sent to. I'll have them ready before I leave." Charlotte looked at him across the table. She thought of all the things she might say. She said, "All right." She wrote through the night. She had always been a methodical person, her father's daughter in that respect if no other. But there was something different in the way she worked now. Something that had been stripped of the hesitation that used to accompany everything she did. She had hesitated in Edward's study. She had hesitated outside parlor doors. She had hesitated in the attorney's office and in Margaret Aldis's parlor, and at a dozen other points where hesitation had cost her time and given Edward room to move. She did not hesitate now. By the time the fire had burned low and the light outside the window had shifted from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn, she had a list of 11 people, a packet of documents copied in her clearest hand, and a letter to Helen Marsh that said, simply and specifically, that there was reason to believe her household or correspondence might have been compromised, and that Charlotte would be in contact through an alternate route she would arrange. She also wrote a letter to her father. This one took longer. She had written and discarded 4 versions by the time she found the one that said what needed to be said without becoming what she no longer had room to be. A daughter hoping to be believed, hoping to be protected, hoping that love was stronger than comfort. The letter she finally wrote was not from that daughter. It was from a woman who had memorized 18 account numbers in a locked study and ridden 3 days into the mountains and built a case from 14 months of documentation while cooking meals on a wood stove, and who was writing to her father not to ask for help, but to give him one last opportunity to be the man she had believed he was. She told him what she had. She told him what she intended to do. She told him that the choice of what to do with that information was entirely his. She did not tell him she hoped he would do the right thing. She had learned that hope, deployed carelessly, was its own kind of weakness. She sealed the letter. She would not know until much later whether her father opened it that morning or set it aside until afternoon, or what expression was on his face when he read it, or how long he sat with it before he did what he finally did. But she sealed it and set it with the others, and then she sat for a moment in the quiet of the nearly dark cabin, and she was not afraid. Tired, yes. Her hand ached from writing. The scrapes on her palms had healed to a thin tightness. Outside, the wind had died, and everything was still in that absolute way that mountains go still in the last moments before dawn. She was not afraid. She thought that was probably the most important thing. Nate left at first light with the packets. He said nothing when he left except 3 days, which meant he would be back in 3 days, and she understood that he would also use those 3 days to speak to people, not loudly, not publicly, but in the careful, specific way he operated, the way of a man who had no social currency and had learned to work in the spaces that didn't require it. She spent the 3 days he was gone doing something she had not let herself do since arriving on the mountain. She thought about what she wanted, not what came next strategically, not what needed to happen to stop Edward or protect Nate's land or build a case that would stand up to men with 30 years of business experience. She had thought about all of that extensively, and she would think about it again. But for 3 days alone on the mountain, she let herself think about the thing underneath all of that, what she wanted her life to look like, not the life that had been planned for her, not the life that had been destroyed, not the life she was fighting to prevent Edward from dismantling further, her life, the one she would choose. She was surprised by how simple the answer was. She wanted to be useful, not decorative, not managed. She wanted to be in a room where her mind was an asset rather than an inconvenience, where the sharpness of her attention was something that was used rather than smoothed over. She wanted to eat real food, cooked over a real stove, and sit across a table from someone who told her the truth without performing it. She wanted this. She was sitting with that realization on the second afternoon, somewhat startled by its clarity, when she heard a horse on the trail below, and went to the door and saw that it was not Nate, but a rider she didn't recognize. A young man, maybe 19, breathless, who pulled up outside the cabin and said, "Ma'am, are you Miss Whitmore?" She straightened. "Yes." "Got a message for you." He handed down an envelope. "Man in town said it was urgent." She opened it before he had finished turning his horse. The letter was from Helen Marsh. It said 3 things. First, that she had received Charlotte's original letter and understood it entirely. Second, that her husband, the circuit judge, had read it the same evening and had, in his words, some questions. Third, that there was to be a land dispute hearing in the county seat in 11 days, that certain parties had applied for an expedited proceeding relating to the Blackwood property, and that Judge Marsh would be presiding. Charlotte read the letter 3 times, 11 days. Edward had not waited a week. He had moved in 3 days, which meant he had been preparing before he came to the mountain, which meant the visit had not been a negotiation. It had been a warning. He had already filed for the expedited proceeding before he rode up to the cabin, before he offered Nate the above-market price, before he told Charlotte she was making a mistake. He had come up the mountain to see how much she had and whether she was bluffing. She hadn't been. Neither had he. She looked at the rider, who had not yet left. "Is there a return message?" he said. Charlotte thought. "Yes," she said. "Tell her we'll be there." The boy rode off down the trail. Charlotte folded the letter carefully, went inside, and sat at the table. 11 days. She looked at what was spread across the table. The copies she'd kept, the organized records, the account numbers in her own handwriting. She looked at the shelf, reorganized and useful. She looked at the map on the wall with its careful markings, 1,100 square miles of survey work that had been taken from a man and called an interpretation. She thought, this is not just about the land. It had never been just about the land. It was about the method. The particular and practiced method of men who took things from people by making those people the problem, by constructing a version of events in which the person who noticed the wrong thing was unstable, mistaken, too emotional to be credible, too female to be authoritative, too damaged by their own loss to be trusted with the truth of what they'd seen. It worked because everyone around it found it easier to believe. Charlotte had let it work on her once. She was not going to let it work on Nate. She was not going to let it work on herself again. She was at the table when Nate came back on the evening of the 3rd day, and she had the letter ready for him, and she watched his face as he read it, and she saw the thing move through him. The same thing she had felt when she read it. That particular cold clarity that arrives when you understand that the moment you've been building toward is no longer approaching. It is here. He set the letter down. 11 days, he said. He was already moving before he came up here, Charlotte said. The visit was reconnaissance. Nate looked at her. Did you know that at the time? I suspected it, she said. I wasn't certain until now. What do we have? Enough, she said. And then, because he deserved the honest version, enough to make a case that requires answers. Not enough to guarantee the answers are the right ones. The judge is Helen Marsh's husband, which is a factor in our favor. But Edward will bring lawyers, and he will bring character witnesses, and he will stand in that room with his 30 years of business reputation, and he will say that the woman making accusations is the same woman who had a breakdown after a broken engagement. Nate listened. So we need something else, she said. Something that makes that story impossible to tell. Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know someone. She looked at him. The surveying I did, he said, for the railroad. There was another surveyor. He left the company the same time I did. Different reasons, same result. He's been in Wyoming for the past 2 years. He paused. He knows what was done with my work. He knows the names on the contracts. And he's had 2 years to be angry about his own situation. Charlotte felt something shift. Would he testify? She said. I don't know, Nate said honestly. But I know he's a man who doesn't like being made a liar of. And the railroad made him a liar of. Can you reach him in 11 days? I can try. Charlotte looked at him. There was something between them in that moment that was neither of them talking about. The weight of what they were walking toward, the size of it, the genuine possibility that they would walk into that courtroom in 11 days with everything they had, and it would not be enough. That Edward Caldwell and his lawyers, and his 30 years of reputation, and his practiced, sympathetic concern would be precisely as powerful as he had always been. That the judge would be fair, and it still would not matter. That the story would be told again, as it had always been told, with the same result. The possibility was real. Charlotte knew it. She thought Nate knew it too. If this doesn't work, he said quietly, he'll have the legal standing to move on the land within 30 days of the ruling. I know. And your name will be worse than it is now, she said. Yes, I know that too. He looked at her steadily. Why are you doing this? She had been waiting for that question, she realized, for the better part of 3 weeks. Not from him specifically, but from herself. The version she could trust. Because I was in a locked study, she said, and I saw something that was real, and I told the truth about it, and I was told that my telling was the problem. And I am tired, she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, of truth being the problem. Nate looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. I'll write to Wyoming tonight, he said. And in the morning, I need you to tell me every single thing you remember about those 18 documents. Every account number, every date, every name on every page. I remember all of it, Charlotte said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the almost smile, not the careful assessment, but something open and direct and entirely unguarded. The face of a man who had been alone with his own certainty for a very long time and had just discovered it was not going to be alone anymore. I know you do, he said. Then let's start, Charlotte said, and they sat down together at the table, and the fire burned steady, and outside the mountain was dark and enormous and entirely indifferent to the two people inside working through the night toward a hearing that could cost them everything, or change everything, depending on which of them turned out to be right about what truth could do when someone refused to put it down. They had 8 days left when the first piece of good news arrived, and it arrived in the form of a telegram so brief it could have been mistaken for nothing. Nate read it at the table and slid it across to Charlotte without a word. It said, "Coming. Bring the survey contracts. R. Dunmore." Charlotte read it twice. "He's coming. He's coming," Nate said. She set the telegram down carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and she did not let herself feel too much about it yet, because she had too early had a way of making you careless. But something in her chest loosened 1/fraction of an inch, and she allowed that much, and then she went back to work. The 8 days before the hearing were the hardest and the most clarifying of her life. She had spent the weeks prior building a case in the way she knew how, methodical, documented, organized. Now she spent the days before the hearing doing something different. She spent them preparing herself for the room. Not for the arguments, not for the documents. Those were as ready as they were going to be. She spent those days preparing herself for the moment she would have to stand in a public place and say what she knew in front of people who had already decided what kind of woman she was. She had tried that once. She knew exactly how it felt. She woke on the 5th morning before the hearing and lay still on the cot for a moment in the early dark, running through every version of the room she could imagine. Edward's lawyers, the character witnesses he would bring, the particular practiced gentleness with which his side would explain that Charlotte Whitmore was a woman of unfortunate instability who had attached herself to a dangerous man out of grief and confusion. She ran through it all deliberately, let herself feel the weight of it, and then she got up and made coffee and sat at the table with her notes and waited for Nate to come inside. He came in at dawn from checking the horses, shook rain from his hat, looked at her sitting at the table with both hands around her coffee cup, and said, without preamble, "You're in your head." "Yes," she said. "What's the part that's worrying you?" She looked at him. "The part where Edward stands up and explains me to people," she said. "He's very good at it. He's been doing it since June, and he hasn't been wrong yet about how people respond." Nate sat down across from her. He did not offer her reassurance, which she had come to understand was one of the most valuable things about him. He never offered reassurance when what she actually needed was thinking. "What's different this time?" he said. She sat with that for a moment. "The judge," she said slowly. "Helen Marsh's husband. He's read the original letter. He already knows the shape of what I found." "What else?" "Dunmore," she said. "He can speak to the railroad situation independently. That separates it from just my word about the documents." "What else?" She looked at him. "You," she said. He met her eyes steadily. "People in this territory know who you are," she said. "Not who they've been told you are, who you actually are. The families you helped in the winter of 1880. The surveying work. 4 families lower on the mountain who are still on their land because of what you did." She paused. "Edward is going to come in with reputation. We're going to come in with record." Nate looked at her for a moment. "That's the difference," he said. "That's the difference," she said. He nodded once, stood up, refilled his coffee, and sat back down. "Then let's go over the account numbers one more time." She told him all 18 from memory, in order, with the corresponding dates and the names of the 2 witnesses who had been present for signings that never happened. He wrote them as she spoke. She had done this twice before, and she would do it again the morning of the hearing, because the account numbers were the spine of everything. The proof that she had not imagined what she saw, had not misread, had not been confused by her grief or her gender or her failure to understand the complexity of business matters. She had read those documents. She had read them carefully and completely, and she had remembered them exactly, and that was going to be what it was going to be. Robert Dunmore arrived 2 days before the hearing on a gray horse with a saddlebag full of documents and the expression of a man who had been wanting to say something for 2 years and had finally been given a room to say it in. Howe was about 40, lean, with a surveyor's particular quality of stillness, the ability to hold perfectly motionless and observe, developed by a profession that required exact measurement of things that did not stay still on their own. He shook Nate's hand first, and something passed between them. The particular recognition of 2 men who have had the same thing done to them by the same people. Then he looked at Charlotte. "You're the one who put the documentation together," he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "I read the copies Nate sent. The correlation between the offer dates and the supply disruptions." He paused. "It's the same method they used on the surveying contracts. Different industry, same architecture." Charlotte went very still. "You can show that?" "I have the contracts," Dunmore said. "Original copies, which I kept because I had a feeling I was going to need them. And I have letters. Internal letters from the company that were sent to me by mistake, and that I have kept for 2 years, waiting for exactly this kind of moment." Charlotte looked at Nate. He looked back at her with an expression that was quiet and complicated and deeply, genuinely relieved. "Mr. Dunmore," she said, "what do the letters say?" "They say," he said carefully, "that the survey results were considered accurate by the company's own engineers, and that the decision to dispute them publicly was made for reasons that had nothing to do with their accuracy." The room was quiet. Charlotte understood what that meant. It meant that the railroad had known Nate's surveys were correct when they called them faulty. They had called them faulty on purpose, as a mechanism, a method. The same method that had been applied to her. The same method that was being applied now. "That's not a separate incident," she said slowly. "That's a pattern. That's the same group of men operating the same way across multiple situations." Dunmore nodded. "That's what I believe. And if we can show the judge the structural similarity—" "We can argue that this isn't a property dispute," Charlotte said. "It's a coordinated effort, with a history." She was already thinking, already moving through what this meant for the shape of the argument, what it changed, and what it opened up. "That changes what we're asking the judge to look at." "Yes," Dunmore said. Edward is going to walk in there expecting to defend one claim, Charlotte said. Against one woman and one man he's already characterized as dangerous. He won't be expecting two independent witnesses with documentary evidence and a structural argument, Dunmore said. No, Charlotte said. He won't. She looked at Nate. We need to reorganize everything tonight, she said. Tell me what you need, he said. They worked through most of the night, the three of them at the table, reorganizing the documentation into the shape of the argument that had just become possible. Dunmore was meticulous and fast. Nate was exactly as useful as he always was, not with the paperwork itself, but with the specific timeline of events, the exact dates, the sequence of pressure that he had lived through and remembered with the precision of a man who had known all along that the details mattered. Charlotte moved between them, building the architecture. By 2 a.m, they had something that was not just a defense. It was a case. She sat back and looked at it laid out on the table and felt something she did not entirely have a word for. Not triumph, not yet, not until the room said so, but the particular and uncommon feeling of having done everything she was capable of doing and believing, genuinely, that it was enough. She slept 4 hours. She woke before dawn and lay still for a moment listening to the mountain. She thought about her father. She had not heard back from the letter she'd sent him. 11 days, and nothing. She had not let herself dwell on it while there was work to do, but in the dark before dawn it was there, the absence of his voice, the image of him sitting at his Sunday desk and choosing, for the second time, the explanation that required the least of him. She got up and started coffee. Nate found her there when he came in and poured his own cup and sat across from her. And in the particular comfortable silence they had built between them, he seemed to know that she was somewhere difficult, because he did not speak, but he also did not leave. And she found that the presence of someone who was not going to perform comfort at her was, itself, a kind of comfort she had not known she needed. My father never wrote back, she said. Nate held his cup, said nothing. I told myself I'd made peace with that, she said. I'm less at peace with it than I told myself. That's allowed, Nate said. She looked at him. Deciding you're done needing something and actually being done needing it are different things, he said. Takes longer to catch up. She thought about that. Does it ever catch up? She said. He looked at his coffee. I needed my father to see me right for about 10 years after he was gone, he said. So I'm probably not the best man to answer that. Charlotte felt something move through her, sharp and tender at the same time. I'm sorry, she said. He shook his head once, not dismissively, just acknowledging it and setting it aside. The point is, he said, that walking into that room today without his letter doesn't mean you're walking in without what you need. You've got what you need. She looked at him steadily. How are you so certain? Because I watched you build it, he said simply. She held that for a moment. Then she said, we should get ready. Yeah, he said. We should. The county seat was 3 hours south, and they rode down the mountain in the early morning with Dunmore, and Charlotte was quiet most of the way, running through the documents in her mind, the sequence of the argument, the account numbers in the order she would present them. She was aware of Nate riding beside her and of Dunmore on her other side, and she was aware that she was riding toward the hardest room she had ever walked into, and she was not afraid. Nervous, absolutely nervous, but not afraid. There was a distinction she had learned in the past month, and it mattered. Fear said, turn back. Nervousness said, this matters enough to feel. She was glad to feel it. It meant she understood the stakes correctly. The courthouse was a square building on the main street of the county seat, and there were more people outside it than Charlotte had expected. Word had traveled, apparently, in the way that word travels in small territories. Not through deliberate announcement, but through the particular permeability of communities where everyone knows every piece of everyone else's business, and hearing is a form of entertainment second only to genuine crisis. She saw Edward the moment they arrived. Howe was standing outside the courthouse with 2 men she recognized as lawyers from Denver, and 3 men she recognized as longtime businessmen of the Valley. His character witnesses, assembled and ready. He was dressed immaculately, which was a strategy as much as a habit. He looked at Charlotte as she dismounted. He looked at Dunmore. Something moved across his face. Not fear, not yet, but a recalculation. His eyes went to door and stayed there for 2 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than a man with nothing to worry about would spend looking at a stranger. He knew the name. Charlotte was certain of it. He knew the name, and he was working out what it meant that the name was here. She did not look away from him. He looked back at her. And then he turned and went inside. Charlotte followed with Nate on her left and Dunmore on her right, and she walked through the door of that courthouse carrying 18 account numbers and 14 months of documentation and a 2-year-old set of internal railroad letters and the testimony of a man who had been waiting exactly as long as she had to say what he knew in a room that was required to listen. Judge Marsh was a compact, deliberate man of about 60 who looked like he had spent his entire career being the least dramatic person in every room he entered, which Charlotte immediately understood was a significant asset in a judge. He had the face of someone who had heard many versions of many stories and had developed, over time, an excellent internal instrument for measuring the difference between a story and a fact. He called the hearing to order. Edward's lawyer went first. How was good? Charlotte had expected him to be good, and he was. He presented Edward's application for an expedited land transfer proceeding with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this many times, in many rooms, and had very rarely lost. He characterized the Blackwood property situation as a straightforward matter of a fair offer being unreasonably refused and escalated by parties with personal grievances and limited legal standing. He characterized Charlotte, without ever saying her name with anything but courtesy, as a woman whose recent personal difficulties had led her to become involved in a legal matter she did not understand. He characterized Nate as a man with a documented history of conflict with multiple business entities in the territory. How was very good. Charlotte sat and listened to all of it, and kept her hands still on the table, and her face composed. And beside her, Nate sat in the same quality of stillness he brought to everything, and she thought, "We have one chance to change the shape of this room, and it has to be the moment we stand up." Judge Marsh looked at her side of the table. "Miss Whitmore, I understand you have prepared a response." Charlotte stood. She had decided, somewhere in the 8 days of preparation, that she was not going to perform anything in this room. She was not going to modulate her voice to be less threatening or more sympathetic, or carefully calibrated to what the room expected from a woman making an accusation. She was going to present facts, in order, clearly, and she was going to trust that the facts were what they were, regardless of who was delivering them. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to begin with the account numbers." She read all 18. Into the complete silence of the room, she read them in order, with their corresponding dates and the names of the 2 witnesses who had been present for signings that never occurred. She read them from memory, without notes, because she had committed them to memory in a locked study on the 14th of June, 1882, and she had not forgotten a single digit. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Judge Marsh was looking at her with the particular attention of a man recalibrating something. Edward's lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor, the witness is reciting numbers from memory with no documentary." "I have the documents," Charlotte said. She set the first packet on the table. "Copies of the original agreements, produced from Mr. Caldwell's own files, which I had sufficient time to read and record before leaving his property. I would like to submit these as evidence." She submitted the packets, one to the judge, one on record. The room absorbed this. She moved to the land case. She presented the 14 months of correspondence, the correlated timeline of supply disruptions and failed contracts, the 3 intermediary companies that traced back to accounts she could document. She presented it in sequence, methodically, without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own if you let them be. She called Dunmore. High took the stand with his saddlebag of documents and the composed, precise manner of a surveyor who understood that accuracy was not about emphasis, it was about evidence. He presented the railroad contracts. He presented the internal letters. He explained what they said. Edward's lawyer objected 3 times. Judge Marsh overruled twice and sustained once on a technicality that did not affect the substance of what was already in the room. Then something happened that Charlotte had not planned for, had not known to plan for, could not have anticipated in any version of the hearing she had run through in her mind over 8 days. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. She heard it before she saw it, heard the shift in the room's attention, heard someone near the back say something in a low voice that she couldn't make out. She turned. Her father was standing in the doorway. Thomas Whitmore, who had looked at his own hands and chosen the comfortable explanation, who had arranged for her to go to Denver and recover her equilibrium, who had not answered her letter, was standing in the back of the courtroom in the same careful suit he wore to important occasions, holding his hat in both hands. Charlotte stopped breathing for a full second. Their eyes met across the room. He looked older than she remembered. That was the first thing she thought. He looked like a man who had not slept well in some weeks, which she understood, because she had not slept well in some weeks either. He looked at her. She looked at him. He gave her one small nod. Just one. But she understood it completely. She turned back to the judge. Her voice, when she found it again, was steady. "Your Honor," she said, "I have one additional witness." Edward's lawyer stood up immediately. "Objection. This was not disclosed." "He arrived this morning," Charlotte said. "I was not aware he was coming." Judge Marsh looked at her. He looked at the back of the room. He looked at Edward's lawyer with the expression of a man who had seen delays manufactured out of procedural objections before and did not find them impressive. "I'll allow it," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," her father said, from the back of the room. His voice was quieter than she remembered it, but it carried. "Thomas Whitmore." The sound that moved through the courtroom was not loud. It was a shift, a collective intake, a room realigning itself around new information. Edward turned in his seat. Charlotte watched his face. She saw the moment it happened. The moment Edward Caldwell, who had spent 4 months building a careful and entirely functional story about a fragile and unfortunate woman and her unfortunate misunderstanding, understood that the story had just become significantly harder to maintain. Because the woman's father was in the room. Not at Charlotte's request. Not as part of a planned strategy. On his own, having read a letter that his daughter had written without hope and sealed without expectation. On his own. Thomas Whitmore walked up the aisle of the courtroom slowly, hat in hand, and he passed his daughter's table without stopping. And for a moment, their hands were close enough that Charlotte could have reached out, but she didn't, because this was not the moment for that, and she thought that he understood that too. He took the stand. Judge Marsh asked him to state his name and his relation to the proceedings. Thomas Whitmore said, "My name is Thomas Whitmore. I am Charlotte Whitmore's father. I am here because I read a letter my daughter sent me 11 days ago, and I spent 10 of those days telling myself it didn't say what it said." He paused. "The 11th day, I got on a horse." The silence in the room was absolute. "I recognized my own signature," he said. "When my daughter described those documents to me, I had already seen them. Mr. Caldwell showed them to me in the spring of last year as part of what he described as a routine investment restructuring." He looked at his hands. The hands Charlotte had watched for 20 years. The hands she knew better than her own. "I looked at them the way a man looks at things when he trusts the person showing them to him. I did not read carefully. My daughter read carefully. She is correct about what she found." Edward's lawyer was on his feet. Judge Marsh held up one hand. Edward's lawyer sat down. The hearing went on for another 2 hours. There were arguments and objections and procedural motions and counter-arguments. And through all of it, Charlotte sat at the table with her hands steady and her notes in front of her and Nate beside her. And she presented what she had to present when she was asked to present it, and she answered every question she was asked with the same quiet precision she had brought to the account numbers at the beginning. It was not a perfect proceeding. Legal proceedings were not perfect. There were moments when she wasn't sure. When Edward's lawyer made an argument she could feel the room considering. When she felt the old familiar weight of being the woman in the room, making claims about a man with more social architecture behind him than she had. But there was a difference. And the difference was that this time, she was not alone. She was not alone in the room, and she had not been alone in the preparation, and she was not the only person in the building whose voice was required to carry the full weight of what was true. That was the difference. Judge Marsh called a recess at 2:30 in the afternoon. He returned 40 minutes later. He delivered his ruling in the careful, deliberate language of a man who understood that the words he used in rooms like this became the record that other rooms would read later. He denied the application for an expedited land transfer. He ordered a full audit of the accounts Charlotte had documented, to be conducted by an independent party appointed by the court. He referred the matter of the forged signatures on the Whitmore investment documents to the appropriate legal authorities for investigation. He noted, for the record, that the pattern of pressure tactics documented in the 14 months of correspondence was, in his view, sufficient to warrant further examination by entities with the appropriate jurisdiction. He did not send anyone to jail that afternoon. That was not what happened in a single hearing. But what happened was this. The story changed. The story that Edward Caldwell had been telling for 4 months. The story of the unstable woman and the dangerous man and the simple, straightforward property matter and the reasonable business arrangement became, in a 40-minute recess and a 10-minute ruling, significantly harder to tell. It did not become impossible immediately. These things took time. The investigation would take time. The audit would take time. But the shape of the story had changed. And in Charlotte's experience, once the shape changed, the story did not go back. She sat at the table after the ruling and let the room come back to her. The sound of it, the movement of people standing and gathering their things, the low conversations starting up. She was aware of her father standing near the door. She was aware of Nate beside her. She was aware of Dunmore on her other side, quietly organizing his documents back into their packets with the methodical care of a man who had done what he came to do. She became aware gradually that Nate's hand was on the table, closer to hers. Not touching, just close. She looked at it. She looked at him. I was looking straight ahead at the front of the room, at the now empty bench, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something loosened, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and had, in the past 40 minutes, been allowed to relax its grip even slightly. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them said anything. They sat like that for a moment in the emptying courtroom. And it was not a dramatic thing, not a performance. Just two people who had built something together and were sitting in the aftermath of finding out it had held. Her father appeared at her elbow. She looked up at him. He looked worse close up than he had from across the room, tired and older and carrying something heavy that she recognized as guilt, which was not the same as regret, and she was glad she had learned the difference, because it meant she could see him clearly. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were simple, and she could see that he meant them, and she could also see, simultaneously, that they were insufficient, that sorry did not return the months she had spent believing herself entirely alone in the world, that sorry did not undo the attorney who had listened for 40 minutes, or Margaret Aldous and her gentle, pitying eyes. She held all of that. She also held the fact that he was here, that he had read a letter sent without hope and gotten on a horse. "I know," she said. He looked at Nate, who had stood when Thomas Whitmore approached, because that was who Nate was, a man who extended basic courtesy regardless of whether the recipient had earned it. Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter's hand, still held in the large scarred hand of a mountain man. Everyone in the valley had called dangerous, and he looked at his daughter's face, and he saw something there that Charlotte did not try to hide and did not try to explain. "This is Nathaniel Blackwood," Charlotte said. Nate nodded once. Thomas Whitmore looked at him for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "Mr. Blackwood," he said. Nate shook it. "She built the case," Nate said simply. "All of it. I carried the packets." Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter. "That," he said quietly, "I can believe." Something moved in Charlotte's chest that she did not entirely have a name for. Complicated and old and new at the same time. The particular texture of a thing that has been broken and is not repaired but is beginning, slowly, to become something different from broken. Not fixed. Different. Outside the courthouse, in the afternoon light, the crowd that had gathered had the particular charged quality of a community that has just witnessed something and is still deciding what to make of it. Charlotte heard fragments. Her name, Nate's name, Edward's name, and she did not stop to listen to any of it, because she had spent enough of her life listening to what rooms said about her. She knew what she had done. She did not need the room to confirm it. Edward was already gone. She had not seen him leave, but his horse was not where it had been, and his lawyers were speaking in low, rapid tones near the side of the building, with the expressions of men reorganizing their professional understanding of a situation. She watched them for a moment. She thought about Edward riding down that road with whatever version of today he was going to construct for himself. The unfairness of it, the overreach, the woman who had never understood the complexity of business and had managed, through stubbornness and a sympathetic judge and a run of unfortunate coincidences, to create a problem where none should have existed. She thought he would believe that version. She thought that was the saddest thing about him. Nate came to stand beside her. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the road south, the road back to Denver, to the valley, to the world that had spent 4 months arranging itself around her absence. She looked at the road north, back toward the mountain. "Yes," she said. She meant the road north. He knew she meant the road north. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon, Dunmore splitting off at the settlement to begin his own journey back to Wyoming, with a handshake and the particular look of a man who has done something that mattered and is satisfied with that. Charlotte and Nate rode in silence the way they had ridden so many other silences. Not empty, but full of things that did not require immediate words. It was Nate who finally spoke. Halfway up the trail, in the long gold light of early evening. "It's going to take time," he said. "The audit, the investigation, none of this is finished today." "I know," Charlotte said. "He still has resources. He'll fight the investigation." "I know. It could be another year before anything final." "Nate," she said. He stopped. She looked at him beside her on the trail, weathered and scarred and more real than anyone she had ever known. "I know," she said again, more quietly. "I know all of that, and I am still here." He held her gaze. "I know you are," he said. The cabin appeared ahead through the trees as the last light faded from the sky, warm and solid, and exactly as it had been when she'd left it this morning, which was still, she thought, one of the most trustworthy things she had ever known. Steady. Exactly what it appeared to be. She dismounted at the fence, and Nate took both horses around to the shelter, and she went inside and lit the lamp and put the kettle on, and when he came in a few minutes later, he found her at the table with her notes stacked neatly, and her hands wrapped around a cup, and the lamp throwing warm light across everything. He poured his own cup and sat across from her. They looked at each other across the table. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You built it. You carried the packets," she said. That almost smile. The one she had learned was rarer and more valuable than anything she had ever been handed in a receiving line or across a dinner table by men who had never once looked at her the way this man looked at her, like she was exactly what she actually was. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Outside the mountain was dark and enormous and entirely itself, and inside the lamp burned steady, and Charlotte Whitmore sat across the table from Nathaniel Blackwood and understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a long, real, true kind of fight, that she had not just won a hearing. She had found the place she was going to stay. The audit took 4 months. Charlotte knew it would take time. She had told herself it would take time. She had told Nate it would take time, and she had told her father the same thing on the 2 occasions he had ridden up the mountain to sit at the table and drink coffee and say very little, which was, she was discovering, the most honest version of her father she had ever known. The one who had run out of comfortable explanations and was left with just himself. She had told everyone it would take time. She had still not been entirely prepared for what time actually felt like while you were inside it. The first month after the hearing was the strangest. The ruling had changed the shape of things but not the texture of daily life, and Charlotte found herself in the odd position of having fought the hardest fight of her life, and then returning to a mountain cabin where the supply shelf still needed organizing, and the accounts still needed tending, and the horses still needed feeding at dawn, regardless of what a circuit judge had decided about land transfer applications. She found she did not mind. That surprised her. She had expected, somewhere in the planning and the preparation and the long nights of documentation, that the hearing would feel like an ending, that after the ruling came down, there would be a clear line between before and after, and she would step over it into some recognizable next chapter. Instead, life continued with the particular indifference to drama that she had come to understand was actually one of its most trustworthy qualities. The fire needed wood. The kettle needed water. The morning came whether or not anything had been resolved. She and Nate continued in the rhythm they had built. She worked the accounts and managed the correspondence that increased steadily in the weeks after the hearing. Letters from other families in the surrounding area who had heard what happened and wanted to know if the documentation method she'd used might apply to their own situations. She answered every letter carefully and thoroughly, because she had been on the other end of a letter that went unanswered, and she understood what that felt like. Nate worked the land and continued quietly, doing what he had always done, helping families who needed it, showing up where there was work to do, maintaining the same steady presence he had maintained for years before anyone outside a 3-mile radius had known his name. The difference was that people in the valley were beginning to know his name differently. It happened gradually, the way most true things happen, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. A family down the mountain mentioned to their neighbors that Nate Blackwood had helped them repair a collapsed fence in October without being asked. A rancher who had repeated Edward's characterization of Nate for 2 years told someone, quietly, that he wasn't sure he'd had the full picture. The woman who ran the post office in the nearest settlement started greeting Charlotte by name when she came to collect the mail, and one afternoon said, without particular ceremony, "That was a brave thing, what you did in that courtroom." Charlotte had thanked her, and meant it, and carried the words home in her chest for the rest of the day. She was writing a letter to Robert Dunmore 6 weeks after the hearing when Nate came inside with an expression she recognized as him, having news he hadn't decided how to present yet. She set down her pen. "What?" He sat across from her and put a folded paper on the table. "From the auditor's office." She picked it up. It was a preliminary report. Formal, dry, written in the particular language of people whose professional function was to describe enormous things in the smallest possible words. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and then she set it down and looked at Nate. "They found the other accounts," she said. "Yes. Not just the ones I memorized, the ones behind those. 6 additional accounts," Nate said. 3 of them tied to the land company that's been writing me letters for 14 months. Charlotte sat with that for a moment. She had suspected it. The architecture of what she'd found in Edward's study had always felt like the visible portion of something larger. Too careful, too practiced to be the first time or the only instance. She had suspected it, and she had built toward it, and she was still sitting in her chair, absorbing the fact that she had been right. "He's been doing this to other people," she said. "At least 4 other families, based on what the auditor found." Nate's voice was even, but she heard the thing underneath the evenness. The anger of a man who had learned a long time ago that performing anger changed nothing, but who felt it nonetheless, clean and legitimate. 2 of them sold already. The pressure worked before anyone knew what it was. Charlotte looked at the preliminary report. She thought about the families who had sold, who had not had a locked drawer full of documents and a memory for numbers and a mountain to ride to, who had taken the declining offers and the manufactured inconveniences and the gentle persistent pressure and eventually, exhausted and beaten down, had signed. She thought about how easy it was to crush people when no one was watching. "The investigation is going to expand," she said. "That's what this means, yes. That means it's going to take longer." "Yes." She nodded once. "All right," she said. She picked up her pen and went back to the letter to Dunmore, because there was now more to tell him, and the correspondence could not wait. It was another 6 weeks before the first real consequence landed. Charlotte was at the supply post in town when she heard it. Not from any official source, not from a letter or a telegram, but from a woman at the counter who was telling someone else in the particular urgent undertone of a person delivering news they consider significant. Edward Caldwell had left Colorado, quietly, without announcement. His house in the valley had been closed, his staff dismissed, his horses sold. He had not filed any new legal actions. He had not made any public statements. He had simply, in the space of a week, disappeared from the social architecture of the Colorado Valley as thoroughly as if someone had reached in and lifted him out. Charlotte stood at the counter and absorbed this information with the same careful neutrality she brought to most things now. She did not feel triumph. She had wondered, in the months of fighting, whether she would feel triumph when something finally moved. She had imagined the moment many times in many forms. Now that it was here, or some version of it, some first evidence that the machine was beginning to fail, she felt something quieter and more complicated. Something that had relief in it, and sadness in it, and a particular anger that would probably never fully resolve, because the families who had already sold their land were not getting it back, and the months she had spent being the problem were not going to be returned to her. What she felt, mostly, was tired in a way that meant the fighting had been real. She bought her supplies and rode back up the mountain and told Nate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not the end of it." "No," she agreed. "The investigation is still running. The audit isn't final. The families who sold are going to need help figuring out what their options are," Nate said. She looked at him. "You've been thinking about that," she said. "For a few weeks," he said. "The documentation you built, the method of it, correlating the pressure tactics with the offer timelines, building the structural argument." He paused. "Other people could use that, if someone showed them how." Charlotte looked at him across the table. She thought about the letters that had been arriving since the hearing. The families who had written asking if what she'd done could be applied to their situations. She had answered each one carefully, with as much specific guidance as she could offer in a letter. But a letter had limits, and she had known that and felt the inadequacy of it every time she sealed one. "You're talking about something more organized," she said. "I'm talking about making the method available," he said. "Not just to people who happen to write to you, systematically." She thought about this. She thought about what it would require, and what it would mean, and whether she was the right person for it. And then she thought about the fact that she had spent 4 months being told she was the wrong person for every room she tried to enter, and she had entered them anyway, and the rooms had been changed by her being in them. "We'd need a proper space," she said. "The south cabin," Nate said. "I've been thinking about it for other uses anyway. Families passing through who need a place to stop. It needs work, but the structure is sound." "I'd need help with the legal side," she said. "Someone who knows land law in this territory." "I know someone," Nate said. A pause. "Dunmore's been talking about leaving Wyoming." Charlotte looked at him. "You've been planning this for more than a few weeks," she said. Something crossed his face that was almost sheepish, which was an expression she had not previously seen on him, and which she found she liked considerably. "Maybe a month," he said. She laughed. It was the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and Nate's expression shifted into the warm thing she had first seen in the courtroom when she put her hand over his, and they sat at the table grinning at each other like two people who had built something from the ground up and were now looking at what else might be possible. "All right," she said. "Let's build something." The south cabin took 3 months to make useful. Nate did most of the structural work, and Charlotte organized the documentation system that would make the space functional, the filing method, the intake process for families who came seeking help, the correspondence protocol. Dunmore arrived in early spring with 2 horses, a crate of legal reference materials, and the particular energized manner of a man who has found a problem worth solving. The 3 of them worked through April and into May, and Charlotte found herself learning things she had not known she needed to know, about land law specifically, about the mechanics of how property transfer proceedings actually functioned at the county level, about the particular points at which documentation could be introduced most effectively. She was a fast learner. Dunmore said so, once, in the straightforward way he said most things, and Charlotte thanked him and went back to the reference material. And she did not perform any particular modesty about it, because she was done performing modesty. She was good at this. She had always been good at the underlying skills. Reading carefully, tracking numbers, identifying patterns, building arguments. She had spent 26 years surrounded by people who considered those qualities charming in limited doses and inconvenient at full strength. She was done with limited doses. The first family arrived on a Wednesday in late May. A woman named Ruth Collier, about 40, with 2 grown sons and a piece of land that a development company had been pressuring them about for 8 months. She came up the mountain with a box of papers and the exhausted, slightly stunned expression of someone who has been fighting something for so long they have begun to doubt their own perception of what they're fighting. Charlotte recognized that expression. She sat Ruth Collier down at the table in the south cabin and poured coffee and said, "Tell me about the signatures." Ruth stared at her. "How did you know it was the signatures?" "It's usually the signatures," Charlotte said. "Start at the beginning." They worked through Ruth's papers for 4 hours. By the end of the afternoon, they had a clear picture of what had been done and what documentation existed and what the viable next steps were. And Ruth Collier looked like a woman who had arrived carrying a weight and discovered, with some surprise, that it had a shape she could work with. "I thought I was imagining it," Ruth said, near the end. "The pattern. I thought maybe I was seeing connections that weren't there." "You weren't imagining it," Charlotte said. "My husband said—" "You weren't imagining it," Charlotte said again, more quietly, and Ruth Collier looked at her, and something in her face understood that Charlotte was not saying it as a general reassurance, but as a specific, experienced, documented fact. "No," Ruth said. "I wasn't." She left with a plan and a copy of the documentation method and Dunmore's contact information for the legal filings, and Charlotte stood at the door of the south cabin and watched her ride down the trail and felt something settle in her chest that she had been waiting for since June. Not triumph. Purpose. The real, functional kind that did not depend on anyone else recognizing it. She went back to the main cabin. Nate was at the table with his journal, and he looked up when she came in, and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other. "First one," he said. "First one," she agreed. "How'd it go?" "Well," she said. He nodded and went back to his journal. She started the kettle. This was life, she thought. This specific and ordinary and genuine version of it. Not the life she had been taught to want. The grand house, the important name, the approval of rooms full of people who had never looked at her carefully enough to see who she actually was. This. A table and a man who kept his word and work that mattered, and enough honesty in the air to breathe without effort. She had lost everything she was supposed to want. She had found everything she actually needed. The summer moved on in the particular rhythm of the mountain, which was its own kind of clock. The work of the land, the work of the south cabin. The letters that continued to arrive, and the families that began, in the months after Ruth Collier, to come more frequently. Word traveled in a territory the way it had always traveled, person to person and trail to trail. And what traveled this time was not the story of a woman who had fallen apart, or a man who was dangerous, but the story of a place on the mountain where someone would actually help you, where the help was practical and specific, and based on your actual situation, rather than on what was comfortable for the person providing it. Charlotte's father came twice more over the summer. The first visit was practical. He had documents she needed for the ongoing investigation, things he had found in his own records that correlated with what the audit had uncovered, and he brought them and explained them, and sat with Charlotte and Dunmore, going through the implications with the careful, thorough attention he had once brought to his Sunday desk work, the attention she had inherited, and he had, for a long time, failed to honor. She watched him work, and she thought about what it cost a person to come back to a truth they had set down when it was inconvenient. She thought it probably cost more than she would ever fully know, because she had not made his choice. She had not had the option of the comfortable explanation in the same way. She had been the woman, which meant the comfortable explanation was the one that made her the problem, and she could not accept that one and still live with herself. He had had the option. He had not taken it. That was not everything, but it was not nothing. The second visit was different. He came without papers, without business, without anything she could identify as a specific purpose. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon and sat at the table and drank coffee and talked to Nate about the land, about the soil composition on the north-facing slopes, about the winter weather patterns, about the practical questions of the ranch in a way that was genuine and curious and without agenda. Charlotte sat and listened to her father talk to this man about his land and his work, and she watched Nate answer with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything, and she thought, "This is the conversation I would have waited my whole life for, and never had if I had stayed." At the end of the visit, when her father was preparing to leave, he took her hands briefly in the doorway, the gesture of a man who was still learning how to bridge the space he had allowed to open between them. "Are you happy?" he said. It was not a social question. It was the real one, the kind he had not previously known to ask her. Charlotte looked at the cabin behind her, at the table where the lamp was burning, and Nate had gone back to his journal, and the kettle was still warm on the stove. She thought about happy. She thought it was not quite the right word, though it was not the wrong one either. What she was something more specific, more grounded, more certain, more genuinely herself than she had ever been in any room she had previously occupied. "Yes," she said. "I am." He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then did not, which was probably wise, and he rode down the trail, and she went back inside. Nate looked up from his journal. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she said. She sat down across from him. He asked if I was happy. "What did you say?" "I said yes." He looked at her steadily. "Is that true?" She met his eyes across the table, the eyes of a man who had never asked her anything except the real question, who had never required her to perform an answer, who had looked at her from the beginning with the particular clear attention that comes from someone who has stopped expecting people to be what they're not, and is simply looking at what is actually there. "Yes," she said. "It's true." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and went back to his journal. She started to laugh, and he looked up with that rare, warm expression that she had learned to read as the fullest version of him, and she thought, "I sat in the mud in the rain on a mountain trail and laughed because there was nothing left to protect. And I got on a horse with a man I'd been told to fear, and he fed me and told me the truth and gave me space to build something, and I built it, and here is where I am. Here is exactly where I am." The final ruling from the investigation came on a Thursday in October, 14 months after Charlotte had walked out of Edward Caldwell's study with 18 account numbers in her memory, and the absolute conviction that she was not going to spend the rest of her life pretending she hadn't seen what she saw. The letter was formal and thorough, and written in the careful language of official proceedings. It confirmed the findings of the audit. It detailed the 6 additional accounts. It named the 4 families whose land had been acquired through documented coercive methods and established a restitution proceeding on their behalf. It referenced the railroad surveying matter that Dunmore had brought to the hearing and noted that a separate proceeding addressing those findings was underway. It confirmed that the Whitmore investment accounts had been subject to unauthorized transfers and that the appropriate recovery proceedings had been initiated. It was not everything. 2 of the families had sold at prices they would not recover from. The time lost was not recoverable. The months of being the problem, the year of fighting, the particular kind of damage that comes from being disbelieved by people who should have known better. None of that had a line item in the official ruling. Charlotte read the letter twice. She folded it carefully. She set it on the table. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin. Then she got up and went to find Nate. He was working on the fence at the north end of the property, the same stretch of fence he had been repairing when she'd come back from mailing the letter to Helen Marsh all those months ago, the moment he had said, "You did it anyway," and she had understood that he saw her in a way no one else had thought to look. He heard her coming and turned. She held up the letter. He read her face before he read the letter. She knew this because his expression changed before she had said a word, shifting into something open and relieved and not at all surprised. The expression of a man who had believed something was coming and was now watching it arrive. He came to her and took the letter and read it, standing in the field in the October light with the wind moving through his hair and the worn fence at his back. When he was done, he folded it the same way she had folded it, with the same care, and he handed it back. "It's not everything," he said. "No," she said. "It's not. But it's something." "It's something," she said. He looked at her, and then he did something she had not expected, something that was entirely unlike the careful, measured way he moved through most of the world. He reached out and pulled her to him, not carefully, not measured, but with the full and uncomplicated conviction of a man who has decided something and is done deciding. And she went without hesitation, because she had been done with hesitation for a long time. And she stood with her face against his shoulder and his arms around her, and the October wind moving over the mountain, and she felt something complete, not finished, complete. There was a difference she had learned to understand. Finished meant ended. Complete meant whole. And she was not finished. There was more work to do, and more letters to write, and more families coming up the trail, and more mornings at the table, with the accounts and the correspondence, and the particular daily texture of a life that was genuinely, practically, specifically hers. But she was whole. She was the woman who had walked out of a locked study with 18 account numbers in her memory and a choice to make. She was the woman who had sat in the mud in the rain and laughed because there was nothing left to perform. She was the woman who had built a case from 14 months of letters and a surveyor's testimony and her own unshakable memory, and had stood in a courtroom and read account numbers into a silence so complete she could hear the judge breathing. She was the woman who had chosen, when given the choice, the man everyone feared. Not because she needed him to save her, because they were better at the truth together than either of them had been alone. She stepped back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and in his face was the same thing that was in hers, the recognition of two people who have found, in the most unlikely place and the most unlikely way, the version of their life that was actually worth living. "I have letters to write," she said. "I know," he said. "And the Hendersons are coming up Thursday." "I know. And the south cabin needs the east wall finished before first snow." 2 weeks, he said. "I'll have it done." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Good," she said. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, and she heard him go back to the fence, and between them was the comfortable, honest, unperformed ease of two people who have chosen each other not in a single dramatic moment, but in every small and practical and genuine one, day after day, with full knowledge of what the other person was and was not. She sat back at the table and picked up her pen. She had letters to write. Ruth Collier had sent a follow-up that needed a detailed response. Dunmore had written with a question about the Henderson filing. There was a new letter in the stack she had not yet opened, from a woman in the next county whose handwriting was unsteady in the way of someone writing under duress, who had heard there was help available on the mountain. Charlotte opened that one first. She read it carefully, all the way through. She picked up her pen, and she wrote back, because that was the work, not the single dramatic hearing, not the ruling that came 14 months later, not the moment in the field when the letter was read and the thing that had been held tightly finally released its grip. The work was this: the daily, practical, specific work of being present and useful and honest in whatever room she was in, with whatever she had, for as long as it needed doing. She had lost everything she was supposed to want, and she had been destroyed by people she trusted, and she had ridden into the mountains with $40 and a horse that went lame, and the absolute refusal to become someone who stayed quiet about what she had seen. And she had built a life that was real. Not comfortable, not arranged, not approved by anyone whose approval she had once valued above her own. Real. The fire crackled. The mountain wind moved past the windows. The lamp burned steady on the table. Charlotte Whitmore pressed her pen to the paper and began. A person's worth is not measured by the world that breaks them. It is measured by what they choose to build when they are free.